I remember that in 1989, there was a populist farmers' party became part of the governing coalition when the Communist Party lost. And the agriculture minister, Baby Law, made a point of bringing in his buffaloes to graze in the yard of his government-issued member of parliament bungalow, right? And
Right.
and it was a big deal. It was this sort of, in-your-face, rural virtue trumps snooty Delhi elite kind of move that was just, purely a play to his farmer base, right? And that's what it was. It's a kind of thing that happens in all populisms, right? It's sort of the appeal to the virtues of ordinary people requires, to some extent, putting down the elite. Now, what's interesting is that often it's not necessarily sort of aristocratic pretension that's put down, but intellectualism. Intellectuals are put down. And why that is, intellectualism is a kind of power that ordinary people blame for decisions, perhaps, that they don't, understand. It's like, it's any first generation college goer experiences this with that parents, where the parent sees the kid talking about things that the parent doesn't understand and resents their own child putting on airs of superiority based on, sort of college learning, so that kind of thing becomes sort of generalized.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
Welcome back to Think Bigger, Think Better. Last week's fake news podcast was so popular, we're going to continue with a theme that also describes aspects of today's political zeitgeist, populism. But before we get into that, let me invite you again, listeners, to review Think Bigger, Think Better on iTunes. I'm giving away free bestsellers to people who support the podcast by doing that. See paulgibbons.net/iTunes. I'd also love listeners to make guest suggestions in the comments on my website or on my Facebook page. I'm especially interested in the Think Bigger part of the show. Who are the most inspiring leaders of today? Tell me what you think, and I will get them on the show. Donald Trump, the populist American president-elect, wants to deport undocumented immigrants. Podemos, the populist Spanish party, wants to give immigrants voting rights. Geert Wilders, the populist Dutch politician, wants to eliminate hate speech laws. Jarosław Kaczynski, the populist Polish politician, pushed for a law making it illegal to use the phrase Polish death camps, referring to World War II. Evo Morales, Bolivia's populist president, has expanded indigenous farmers' rights to grow coca. Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines' populist president, has ordered his police to execute suspected drug dealers. So populists may be militarists, pacifists, admirers of Che Guevara or of Ayn Rand. They may be tree huggers, opposing pipeline developments, or drill baby drill climate deniers. What makes all of those people populists? Does the word even mean anything because it covers such a wide range of phenomena? In my view, populists are defined by the claim that they alone represent the real people, what Germans call the Volk, and that all other claims to power are illegitimate. So they unite the real people against a corrupt, sometimes intellectual, certainly privileged elite. On the other hand, populist movements are rife with animal spirits. They're highly charged emotionally, and they're certainly not always rational. And are they good, bad, necessary, indifferent, or varied in how they interact with something that's of importance to us all, which is democracy, either in aberrant form or a national offshoot of our democratic processes? Today, to discuss populism, we have Dr. Arun Swamy, who received his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include democracy in developing countries, ethnicity and nationalism, political economy, corruption, and state building. And he's published on all these topics. His dissertation combined these various threads through an examination of populist appeals in Indian politics, and he's extended his study of populism to Asian politics generally. His special contribution to the study of populism has been the analysis of what he has termed sandwich coalitions, which is an alliance of the elites with marginalized groups against the middle. Arun, welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better. We're going to talk about populism, and I read today that one study suggests that populist parties used to claim only about 5% of the vote share, and now that's risen to nearly 25% of the vote share. So it's a simple question that won't have a simple answer, but what is populism, and why do you think this is happening?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on. Oh, boy. You just started with the biggest question of all, didn't you? Let me first say about the number you gave me. I don't know if I've heard that, and I don't know what countries or set of countries it refers to. It doesn't surprise me, but I also wonder if there isn't a lot of variation. What is populism? The best definition that I ever read came from Peter Wiles, where he says populism is any creed or movement based on the premise that virtue resides in the simple people who are the overwhelming majority and in their collective traditions. And in my work, I kind of amended that to say populism is any ideology that believes virtue resides in the simple people who have been robbed. And I think that adding the who have been robbed is important because populism it's an ideology of grievance that tries to unite people in very different circumstances, hence the sort of the undifferentiated subject, the people, against somebody who's not of the people who's robbed them, right? So that there's an idea of loss, and there's an idea that somebody is responsible for the loss, and there's an idea that there is solidarity among the majority of a society who share certain things in common that those who rob them do not, right? So, you could say, you pointed me to a definition by Cass Mudd, in which he says populism is, a framework that sets up an opposition between a pure people and a corrupt elite. That's, similar idea. So these definitions all circle around the same idea going back to the 1960s.
Do you think when you listen to the term, and I mean, you can't really avoid the term if you live in the United States or England right now among commentators, either on cable news or in the mainstream press. So are they using the term, in your view, correctly, people, when it's thrown around the way it is today?
Yeah, I'm not sure they are. For one thing, I've found, people often just use the term populism to disparage movements or ideas that they think are dangerous, or to sort of lump together anything that's anti-establishment, or even sometimes just on the other hand, sometimes people, self-identified populists will limit the term to those things that they think the people want. I think it's bandied about a lot, and every once in a while someone will come along and say, maybe we should get rid of this term altogether. But it sticks around because it captures something. And that something is sort of the recurrence in different societies of movements or leaders who speak to sort of a large, one definition says populism addresses a multi-class coalition. So there's an idea of people of different economic circumstances coming together around shared grievances, right?
Yeah.
So it sticks around.
Is it always, does it always have to be radical? Is it always called for somewhat radical change? And I suppose a question, I suspect it's confused because of the same root with the word popular. So is it always radical, and do populist movements have to be popular?
Well, obviously populist movements don't have to be popular. And you can just look at Occupy Wall Street, which didn't take off. It was, Occupy Wall Street followed a classic populist script. We are the 99%. Everyone in the 99% is being robbed by the 1%. It just didn't catch on,
Right.
Is it radical? One of my favorite quotations about populism is that populism is Janus-faced. It looks both forwards and backwards. It can be both progressive and regressive, right? There are left-wing and right-wing populism, sometimes representing similar constituencies. Canada famously had, in Alberta, had a rural and agrarian farmers populist movement, the Social Credit Party, which was quite right-wing. And right next door in Saskatchewan, there was another populist movement, the Progressive Party, that was quite left-wing and social democratic. And both sort of represented a form of agrarian populism with very similar grievances, but they built on them in different ways.
Interesting. So it could be it could be progressive or retrogressive. So it can attempt to derive inspiration from the past, and we have to return to the people's values. That sounds like Nazi Germany to me in a way, but as well the Volksvalue, the real people. And that would be the sort of retrogressive, historical looking populism. And then there's a progressive kind of populism that looks forward. What's an example of that, perhaps?
Well, I think the trick to understanding populism is that most of them are both, right? They
I see they're
draw
both, not either or. Okay.
right, and many take the farmers' movement in the 19th century in the United States, which is in some ways kind of the classic modern populist movement, right? It drew on a lot of nostalgic rhetoric about rural life, but its agenda became the agenda of the progressive movement in the 20th century. It was very forward-looking in terms of some of the things it wanted to achieve, including achieving direct election of senators, including introducing an income tax. Lots of the things they wanted represented progress, at least from a kind of a center-left perspective. But it wasn't always, couched in terms of it was couched in terms that were anti-finance, anti-industrial, but they weren't really trying to go back.
Right, right. Well, maybe it would help. It would certainly help me. I hope it would help listeners also to look at some things that are happening today, both maybe some political movements and some terms. Maybe let's do some political movements first. So, in what ways could the Trump movement be seen as a populist movement?
Excellent. Well, let's take a step back from the Trump movement, which is to some extent Trump jumped in front of a parade, and go back to the Tea Party, the early Obama era, right? And the Tea Party is, it's a classic sort of conservative populist movement. There's a lot of debate on the left. Was it really grassroots? Was it so-called AstroTurf? Because you get a lot of well-to-do donors and leaders sort of helping to fund it. But that's true of a lot of populist movements. The sentiments that it drew on. I don't know if you remember, but it started off with this classic sort of, if you remember the movie Network from the 1970s, Howard Beale's moment where he comes out and yells, "I'm not going to take it anymore." It starts off with, I can't remember the guy's name on CNBC. It starts with an S, coming out and ranting about Obama handouts to people, Obama rescuing people who have taken on home equity mortgages to buy new furniture. It's like he kind of couched the entire housing mortgage crisis in terms of a few slackers robbing everybody else's tax money.
Which we know to be nonsense, but
which was utter nonsense as an explanation of what happened. Yes, absolutely. But it touched a nerve, and the Tea Party really kind of snowballed from that. And it was a classic sort of right-wing anti-big government, anti-taxes, anti-regulation. The kinds of themes the Tea Party expressed were quite classically populist, focusing on local communities, focusing on individualism and not wanting the government to come in. That's all pretty populist, And I often ask my students, why do you think Occupy Wall Street didn't work and Tea Party did? And to some extent, I think it's because the Tea Party tapped into themes that are American political culture is much more receptive to, which is
100%, yeah,
right, individualism, where as opposed to sort of the 1% against the 99% is a construct that doesn't resonate in the United States.
Well, I don't think Occupy was able to look backward and forward in the Janus-like way that you described, perhaps. I mean, Occupy certainly had its mind
Right.
on a different future, but the Tea Party draws some of its inspiration from, the founding fathers, American
Right.
values.
Right.
What do they
Right.
say in Germany? Kinderkirche and Küchen, the folk, the real peoples, those sort of real American kind of virtues. Whereas
Exactly.
Occupy
Right.
really was you know, a bunch of straggly hippies, according to a
Right.
video
Right.
caricature.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you just tapped into something important, which is that there's a lot of debate over, is populism primarily economic or cultural in its motivation. And I think the secret to understanding populism is that it tends to wed the two, right? Economic grievances are tied in with cultural motifs, and that's not, E.P. Thompson wrote this fabulous book on the making of the English working class, in which he talks about the role of culture and identity in sort of cementing working class solidarity in England, something that was absent in the United States, right? So it's not exclusive to, say, populist movements that cultural symbols, cultural identification is important for creating a sense of solidarity, right? But
It's interesting because the Harvard paper that I'm going to ask you a few questions about a little bit from the Kennedy School that just came out, I think, a little while ago, splits those two very much in half and sees them as separate causal factors. And you're actually very much linking them together, which is an interesting point of
right,
view.
I probably haven't read the paper you're talking about.
Yeah, we'll have a look. We'll have a look. Yeah, I'm sure you'll be. It's not probably not earth shattering, but what about Brexit? Let's talk about. Well, oh no, you were going to actually. We went back to the Tea Party, but you were going to talk about
Right,
Trump. That was
right, right. So jumping forward to Trump, Trump tapped into something, right? And what he tapped into is, and I think it is telling us, it's hardly original on my part to observe that, that there was some overlap in his constituency and in Sanders, right? And in the grievances thereof. And that was true even of the Tea Party and Occupy, right? They both objected to handouts to Wall Street and all that kind of thing in terms of Occupy and Tea Party. Trump and Sanders were both anti-trade, right? So they were both concerned, at least expressed concern, both spoke to the travails of the industrial working class in the Midwest. And so, in that sense, and they both ascribed those travails specifically to trade. And so, in that sense, there was an interesting overlap. And for Trump, the way he puts it together ties trade and integration together, right? Whereas for Sanders, the way he puts it together ties trade and big money corporate greed together, right?
right.
So there's kind of a different linkage made there. But Trump's populism, if you want to call it that, and there's sort of an uneasy relationship between nativism and populism. I don't think you can collapse them into one another, but they clearly often overlap. Trump's populism clearly identified an ordinary people, which is middle class white Americans, who were being robbed due to no fault of their own by forces that were unleashed upon them by a kind of a feckless and corrupt elite, mostly feckless more than corrupt. I mean, he keeps talking about the incompetence of the Washington elite and their sort of inability to negotiate good deals. And sort of, it's really more about the fecklessness of the elite. But it was an interesting kind of thing, and if you go back, the first time I really started to think Trump could win was the first question of the first debate. When both candidates are asked, what are you going to do about stagnant wages? And Hillary Clinton really didn't give a very crisp answer. And Trump said, I'm going to stop trade and stop immigration and bring jobs home. That was a very clear answer, right?
and grow the shit out of the economy. Yeah.
Right.
How about that?
Right. Well, hey, a diagnosis has to be plausible or a diagnosis has to resonate.
I thought she was terrible on trade. I think she was very credible on foreign policy and on other issues. I thought she was absolutely terrible when she's asked questions about trade. But
Yeah, because she said stuff she didn't believe, and that was a problem, right?
possibly true. Yeah, possibly true. So what about, let's quickly dive over to Europe. What about Brexit and Macron?
Right. Very different phenomena. I will confess, first of all, that I've never been to the UK, right? It's funny because growing up partly in India, I probably know more about the UK than any other place I've never been to. I know more English history than I do, almost Indian history,
They pour it down. They pour it down your gullet from the age of 6.
Right, right. Yeah, something like that. But at the same time, I've never been there, so I'm not convinced that there's a. Let's take, the great historian of American populism, Richard Hofstadter, who's a great historian in general. He talked about the hard and the soft side of populism. Right? There's a kind of a romantic gloss, and there's a hard materialist economic interest component, right, to what the populist movement was about, the farmers' movement in the 19th century. And I think the same is true for Brexit. And I think if you focus on, the most stunning thing that I read about Brexit was, and I don't remember the exact figures, but that real wages in the UK, despite very, very low unemployment, declined more than in any other EU country except Greece, right?
Right. Wow. I did not know
And
that.
Yeah, and that fact by itself says more about what Brexit was about, right? Because Brexit, first of all, you have to start off with sort of the Euroscepticism in the UK all along, right from the beginning,
From the very
from the
beginning.
very beginning, even in the 70s, and then of course not joining in the Eurozone in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So there's always a tension between, sort of maintaining distinctive, particularly English identity.
Yeah, it's a British exceptionalism. I mean, it's called Little Englanders is the pejorative there.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I think they're full of baloney, but
Right.
anyway.
Right, but there's also a hard side to it, and the two kind of come together. The soft sort of Little England identity defense becomes empowered by the hard side, which is the real decline in wages, even in the midst of economic growth and job growth, right? And so, you asked me earlier, I think, if populism can point to real solutions. And one of the things that Brexit points to very clearly is the need for British policymakers to address wage stagnation, right?
Yes.
What's interesting about it is that because the main, I think it's telling that for Theresa May, the main sort of thing she's been trying to hold on to in the Brexit negotiations is immigration and free movement of labor, right? It's the one thing she doesn't want to sign it to buy into, even if she tries to stay in a common market. And the reason for that, of course, is I don't view what happened in the UK as being just sort of nativism, because from one point of view, it was primarily about Polish immigration under the EU. If this was just racism, it would have been much more. It would have happened much earlier, as it did happen, but it didn't take off in the same way against South Asian immigrants.
Sure.
There's the economic aspects of the migration question, I think, are much more central and much more salient in Brexit than people give it credit for. Whether it's the correct analysis or not, I don't know. But
well, one thing that's true about England is it's been both prior to the Great Recession and subsequent to the 2008 Great Recession, it's done better if you look at macro terms.
Right.
Than almost any other country in Europe. I think perhaps the exception of Germany. It fell less far, even despite an austerity policy, and it's grown very quickly. Despite what's happened with Brexit, it continues to sort of chug along. And so what people read in the press is, of course, how well the economy is doing and how much GNP is growing and how much the city is booming. The city is the financial district for American listeners. And they think, gee, I don't really feel like I'm nearly as well off as I used to be. And the electricity bill has gone up from this to that, and we're struggling. So there's a disconnect between the macroeconomic, and that's also happened in the United States. So the stock market's gone from 8,000 to 18,000 under the tenure of Obama, which is good for lots and lots of people. But you could be well asked, well, why, there's a disconnect between that and the GNP numbers and how people feel, the subjectivity of their experience as workers and as citizens, as community members.
Right. And you have to add to that in both cases, the geographic component, right? I mean, one of the things that populism thrives particularly on kind of uneven development, on a center periphery cleavage, right? And one of the things about Germany is that I guess they had that some with East Germany, but industrial production and growth are much more spread out, right? And I mean, in England, you really have the growth concentrated not just in the financial sector of the City of London, but specifically in the geographical region of Greater London.
Yeah.
And so the sort of the left behind regions in the north of England, I mean, I'm saying stuff that has been said 1,000 times,
Yeah.
but that divergence of experience clearly feeds into the perception that the EU is really all about London, and you have something similar in the United States where the Midwest has been left behind. Ironically, the South is actually the growth area, but they're kind of retrograde for other reasons, But the contrast between the fate of the Midwest and the fate of the Northeast, right, which
Yeah.
is the center of sort of cosmopolitanism and finance and all the rest of it, is part of the story perhaps of Trump.
Yes, the bicoastal elites. And I suppose in terms of economic growth, the Southwest has been a great beneficiary. I live in Colorado, which is very purple, and it's also a huge beneficiary of that. But, I've been to Detroit. I've been to Gary, Indiana. I played in a poker tournament, which is in a place called East Chicago. And I've almost never been in a place which has I've seen more economic privation than there. And East St. Louis, I've never felt more at risk than driving through East St. Louis. These are places, I sometimes think for every leafy suburb that America has with broad boulevards, 3 cars in every driveway, you should almost be made to take a virtual tour of some of these places they look, they're indescribably third world looking in terms of the crumbling buildings, crumbling roads, crumbling infrastructure, crumbling shopping malls, crumbling factories. So anyway, it's quite something.
But those places, I mean, one of the interesting things about those places is that their decline began a lot earlier, and it began, because of the racial cleavages, because of white flight as much as anything else. And my wife's family is entirely from the Detroit area, but they're all in the suburbs, right? They were part of the flight to the suburbs, and the suburbs of Detroit are still quite prosperous, and the auto industry is coming back, but with less manufacturing employment and more sort of high tech and design jobs, but that area is the area where it's really the sort of the swing area for Michigan, right? The Detroit votes Democratic, the farther reaches of Michigan vote Republican, but the suburbs of Detroit are kind of a swing region, and you can overplay the flyover narrative of what's going on in those places, because they're pretty sophisticated and they don't necessarily, sort of have the same kinds of antipathy towards cosmopolitan New York that we project onto them, but they do have a sense that their regions aren't prospering as much, which is a different kind of thing.
Yes. We talked about 2 kinds of causes, and I think that'd be an interesting place to stop for a minute. So they're usually split, and anything that divides things that neatly cleaves them into 2 is going to be weak before you start.
Right.
But basically 2 causes: economic insecurity and cultural backlash. And I guess part of the economic insecurity theory is that there's an asymmetry of benefits from globalization, that it was initially very, very good for consumers, cheap stuff, Walmart, always been very, very good for shareholders because of expansion of markets in the East and cheaper supply chain from the East also. So very good for Wall Street, very good for consumers, less good for the workers who are displaced. But now the consumer benefits have been realized. So think prices aren't tumbling. There's no, apart from Amazon, we're not getting cheaper and cheaper goods any longer. So from the point of view of the people who were once benefited from the consumers who benefited from cheaper goods, well, they're no longer tumbling. Prices are no longer tumbling. And so what you're left with is tumbling wages or job losses or communities that are, high levels of unemployment. So that's the asymmetry of benefits theory. Is there any truth to any of that?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably pretty good for the United States and industrialized Western Europe, right? One can draw links between globalization and populism in different parts of the world, but the mechanics would be different. What are the if you look at, say, Duterte, right, or if you look at my favorite sort of 21st century populist, who was Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, who was a billionaire, the richest man in Thailand, became prime minister, introduced a number of welfare policies, then got overthrown because of a middle class revolt against him in Bangkok, and removed from power by the army. And his party remains the most popular party in Thailand today. It was just another recent coup against his sister. So when you look at somebody like that, right? I mean, Thaksin came in in the wake of the 1997 Asian flu, right? Which is clearly a result of globalization, but in a different way than you're suggesting, right? So you would have to flesh out the ways in which you would have to sort of differentiate the ways in which globalization affects different parts of the world to understand the different kinds of populism arising in different parts of the world.
Right. That was a very US-centric view. Right. One corollary of that is that actually the European, because of these more, I was going to say superior welfare states, but I suppose that nails my colors to the mast. But because of the creation of the better support for worker dislocation, trade, there's not been the huge resistance to trade, except for England. Right. That there has been in the United States, because workers who are dislocated are very much better supported when they're dislocated.
Sure. And of course, and in England, part of the problem was also that some of those supports were cut back.
Right. And what about this cultural dimension? So it's sometimes described as there's a inevitable cultural movement towards mass education, post-industrial societies, automation, knowledge workers, etc. And not everybody that doesn't, apply. There's a sort of a counter-revolutionary, counter movement, which is people who are older, less educated, white men who've been feel subjectively, their subjective experience is that they know their decrease in power and cultural importance. So that's part of the theory, that they reject progressive values in this kind of this inevitable march of the technological society. I mean, to what extent does that capture some version of the cultural dimensions?
I think it clearly does, but I mean that's nothing new, right? You don't have to go back to 19th century England, right? I mean, the term, why am I blanking?
Luddite. Was it Luddite?
Luddites, right? The Luddite movement, it's seen as kind of a retrograde reaction to progress, but it's also people trying to sort of save their jobs. Craft workers trying to save their jobs by smashing machines, right? So there's it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, sure.
The word sabotage comes from workers throwing their clogs, which were called sabots, into machines to stop them working, which I didn't know.
That I did not know.
Sabotage is throwing their clogs into machines just to break them. Interesting.
I will undoubtedly start quoting that without crediting you.
I would look it up first, but I think I'm right. It sounds erudite when I say it, right?
Right, exactly. It sounds perfect, in fact. It's French, among other things, which is great. You can blame the French for it.
So this cultural shift away from traditional norms, away from traditional values, that's where we were.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. The value issue in the U.S. is murky, right? Because if you look at the Midwest, I'm not sure the value component is really all that strong in the Trump support. The value component is much more sort of in the South and sort of the evangelical support base and all that. And there's been a lot written about, and often, in fact, from quite prosperous communities. I mean, the evangelical community is not economically deprived, right? But, there's sort of a sense of localism, maybe that would be the charitable way of putting it, that the sort of the resentment of the growth of the federal government and localism, small business ethos, celebration of small entrepreneurs, a lot of that kind of fits in with it as well.
Well, very good. Well, let me advance another sort of causal theory through you. So someone says, well, why don't established parties pay attention to the discontent, the grievances, as you put it, of people. Why are they abject failures? And I guess one theory that's advanced is that they respect, if you want, institutions and institutional constraints like the European Union or the IMF or NAFTA or political parties or allegiances within political parties. And they're unwilling to break with the institutions to satisfy the grievances of the voters. Is that something accurate as a hypothesis?
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. That may be giving them a little bit too much credit, right? I mean, just let's just take the Republican Party in the United States. They've certainly been willing to bend institutional constraints for repeatedly throughout the Obama era, most notably in sort of holding off on for a year on even holding hearings on a Supreme Court nomination. But that was just one of many examples. So it's not clear to me that establishment parties are necessarily always respecters of institutional constraints. But what they are is they're the product of a particular pattern of interests that they reflect. And it's very hard for parties to give up established patterns of support.
Right.
That's really more often
patterns of influence, patterns of support.
Right.
It's hard for them to abandon those. There's this conservatism built into those relationships, is what you're saying.
Right. Yes.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I suppose there's one thing is that our populist sort of anti-institution, you're saying they're not always anti-institutions, because it's easy to downplay institutions and their importance and their value in the short term. And we're going to tear down, drain the swamp and, throw the bums out as the rhetoric goes, without downplaying the long-term consequences of not having institutions, which, some of which safeguard our health and our water and our educational infrastructure and our infrastructure and all of that. So
populists certainly aren't necessarily anti-institutions. Typically, they tend to sort of distinguish between good, true institutions and bad, corrupt ones, right? I mean, take the Tea Party. It's like the Tea Party's entire rhetoric is built around the idea of defense of the Constitution as they understand it, right? So
right.
Rhetorically, they are in their own estimation the ultimate institutionalists. Now, one can debate whether their understanding of the Constitution is a valid one, but that's a different debate.
Interesting. And what about two other words that are tossed around a lot when we're talking about populism? Anti-intellectualism and anti-cosmopolitanism. Those are two other flavors, if you will.
Yeah. And that I think is really important. I mean, step back from both of those and put them under an umbrella term, which is anti-elitism, right?
Right.
Populism is almost quintessentially anti-elite, right? And I like to tell this story, sometimes, when I was in my 20s and living in New York, and I was living in Brooklyn, and I sprained my ankle one Saturday night, I think it was, So I couldn't go out very far, so I bought the Sunday New York Times and went, what you could do in New York on a Saturday night. I went to a bar, put my foot up, and was reading it, right? And it was kind of a working class young people's bar. It was in Park Slope, which is kind of a mixed middle and working class neighborhood. And this young woman sitting next to me turned to me and said, "Excuse me, could I look at the funnies?" So I very politely said, "I'm sorry, the New York Times doesn't have funnies." And she said to me, and I'll quote it directly, and hope it doesn't offend anyone, "And you're an effing brain, right? You F word again, right?" I was stunned. Later on I became friends with her, but it was just, and it was actually a setup, I realized later, because there's this whole, New York has this entire sort of symbolism around people who read the Daily News and people who read the New York Times. Daily News funnies and the New York Times doesn't, and and all it goes along with, like, do you drink beer or wine, or do you go to the baseball game or the opera, which is a whole bunch of really silly dichotomies. I do neither. When it comes to baseball games and opera, I don't like either one. So I don't know what that's right. I mean, so there's that kind of thing, and it's about a whole bunch of things. It's partly about people looking down on us because they think we're better on us. That kind of sort of small d democratic impulse that says, look, you're no better than us, which is good, which is healthy, and that's a part of populism, sort of a commitment to social equality, if you will. That's the positive side of it. But the other side of it is specifically Number one, anti-intellectualism, right? And Hofstadter, again, wrote a famous book on anti-intellectualism in American life. And it goes very much with the sort of the democratic ethos, because in the United States, it's common, but it's not just the United States. It's like anti-intellectualism. Indian populist movements are often built around anti-intellectualism because India has, a very distinct, historically distinct
Right.
intellectual class, right, which were differentiated by caste, even, right. So populist movements are specifically anti-intellectual in that sense. I remember that in 1989, there was a populist farmers party became part of the governing coalition when the Communist Party lost. And the agriculture minister, Baby Lal, made a point of bringing in his buffaloes to graze in the yard of his government-issued member of parliament bungalow, right? And it was a big deal. And it was this sort of, in your face, rural virtue trumps snooty Delhi elite kind of move that was just, purely a play to his farmer base, right? And that's what it was. It's a kind of thing that happens in all populisms, right? It's sort of the appeal to the virtues of ordinary people requires, to some extent, putting down the elite. Now, what's interesting is that often it's not necessarily sort of aristocratic pretension that's put down, but intellectualism. Intellectuals are put down. And why that is,
That's a good question.
It has a lot of explanations. One of them is intellectualism is a kind of power that ordinary people blame for decisions, perhaps, that they don't, understand. It's like, it's any first generation college goer experiences this with their parents, where the parent sees the kid talking about things that the parent doesn't understand and resents their own child putting on airs of superiority based on, sort of college learning, so that kind of thing becomes sort of generalized, if you will.
Yes. Interesting.
Cosmopolitanism is slightly different, which is that it has very much to do with sort of localism, local cultural virtues. Cosmopolitanism is associated with rootlessness. It's associated with lack of loyalty to one's own community, right? I think there's a lot of issues with sort of group membership and loyalty tied in with anti-cosmopolitanism as well.
Right. Yeah, I don't recognize within myself any patriotism or nationalism or localism as well. But it sounds like such an effete and poncy things to say, to use an English expression, to say I'm a citizen of the world, but I'm eligible for, I think, 4 different passports, and I sort of live in the United States and spent half my life here and half my life in Europe. But I feel very much that I'd have more in common with a university professor from Istanbul or a university professor from Bangladesh than I would have with one of my neighbors, perhaps if I were living in Oklahoma, or someone who is an industrial laborer in Oklahoma. So if you want, my cultural milieu is a very kind of global thing. And I'm just the sort of person that's very easy to despise, I think, if you're a localist in your viewpoint. But Theresa May said she said something quite contemptuous. She said, if you think you're a citizen of the world, you don't understand what the word citizen, I paraphrase her, you don't understand the word citizen, what that means. And I think that's representative of the sentiment, I think. Well, good. Well, you have a theory. So, and I suppose we should think about ending with this. Let's see if I could put this together. You have a theory called the sandwich theory of populism. I think it's probably worth touching on that before we wrap up, because that's something.
There's 2 separate things. One is sort of, I talk about something called sandwich coalitions, which are not unique to populism, where sort of alliances between the extremes of a hierarchy against the middle. And you can find this in international relations, where great powers ally with small states against regional powers. You can find this in sort of the appeal of commoners to the king against the depredations of the lord, which is a theme that's that was quite common in European history, and particularly in the era of state building, right? So it's a recurring kind of alliance building motif, and I argue in the case of populism that there's sort of 2 different strands of populism. I call it an empowerment strand, which is really sort of upwardly mobile groups wanting to get access to power. And there's a
Yep.
protection strand, which is protecting people from harm, right? They're often tied in together in one movement, but they sometimes split into competing strands of populism, which is something I talked about in India. And the way they split is through sandwich coalitions. Sandwich coalitions, defensive elites faced with populist movements, basically come into sort of the leaders of sort of these classic populist movements that tie the middle and the poor against the elite and say, hey, you guys in the middle don't really represent those people down there. You're their enemies. We'll protect them from you. And they come in and kind of provide a more paternalistic, well, which is this is a word another scholar has used for the same thing, approach to welfare. And so that's kind of
you could look at Trump this way, couldn't you? I mean, he's a billionaire himself, and he's friends with many. He has Mnuchin on his cabinet. He's the Koch brothers would be. I think they've been rather silent or something like that, but he certainly represents the interests of the wealthy, despite his protestations, and he certainly has white working class support, particularly against probably not the middle class, although it's yet to be seen if he does anything at all for the American middle class, but certainly against the bicoastal elite, certainly against the educated, certainly against the experts, certainly against policy wonks. So there's certainly some people who are getting squeezed in the middle. I don't think it's against the middle class. I don't think. But anyway, what's your thought about Trump sandwich? The Trump sandwich, that's very good.
my thought about Trump is actually slightly different, which is a lot of his constituency are in fact significantly drawn from the middle class, sort of insecure middle class. And to some extent, he's actually scapegoating the people below them, right? So he's kind of doing the reverse of a sandwich coalition. He's scapegoating particularly Latino immigrants, but less obviously, but implicitly also African Americans. The real sandwich coalition in American politics is the Obama coalition, right? The Obama coalition, which draws on elite educated professionals, the poor and minorities, against mostly the old sort of, and less so on the old white middle class and working class, right? So that's kind of.
I guess you could look at the Trump phenomenon as actually, I stand corrected, as actually appealing because he did win a majority of white male middle class voters, didn't he? And so absent his showing among minorities, and he did win, be hard to say, but among very affluent voters. So you could say he forged a broad coalition of Americans.
It's a populism of the middle, not a populism of the top and the bottom, is what I would say.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Stand corrected there. Well, look, this has been a marvelous discussion. Are there any final remarks? Where do we go from here? I suppose would be a good way to finish, or anything like that. What happens now? Want to put your crystal ball out?
My suggestion to people wringing their hands about populism is to remember that the sort of the classic book on populism, which was written in the 1960s. Began with a play on Marx's the opening line of Marx's Communist Manifesto, which is "The specter is haunting the world. It's the specter of communism." This book began a specter is haunting the world, and it's the specter of populism. That was 50 years ago. This is a recurring thing. Don't worry about it.
Right. All right. Well, that's good. That's probably a good place to end, with some reassurance that we've been here before, and it's not the first time. I want to thank you. Thanks really for your insights and for your time.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. This was a lot of fun.
In this super fun part of the show, I get to talk about great books I'm reading, and there are two especially great ones out right now, both on democracy and on liberalism. The first is by the Financial Times Washington correspondent Edward Luce. It's called The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and it's a cracking analysis of our current turmoil in just a few hundred pages. See my website for a link review. The other great book is from one of my philosophy professors, Anthony Grayling. It's called Democracy in Its Crisis. Grayling is perhaps the best known of contemporary political philosophers, and his book traces the history of democracy from Plato to Locke to Montesquieu and to its first implementations in the UK and subsequently, of course, in the United States and France. Where did the ideas like separation of powers come from? How did they arise? Why, until the 18th century, was democracy used as a term pejoratively rather than, seen as today the finest and greatest and the apex of what we can achieve politically with one another. So both two really, really fascinating books, and both are 200-page reads. You can read them in an afternoon if you get down to work on it. So thanks for checking those out, and I look forward to talking next week.
To celebrate the launch of the show, and to thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books. Lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy-to-follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.